Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people joining us for this webinar about inflation. My name is Chris Jenkins. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of Prices Division within the Office for National Statistics. So we've got responsibility ultimately for the publication of our inflation measures every month. We cover a wide range of inflation measures, such as the consumer prices, house prices, business prices. We're going to focus on the consumer prices today in this webinar. Can I move on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to start at the beginning, and we're just going to think about what is inflation. We talk about it quite a bit. So there's no single definition in terms of inflation, but a useful version from Wikipedia is inflation is a general increase of the prices of goods and services in an economy. So in plain terms, we're thinking about how much a price is increasing. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And inflation is really important. It's been very topical recently. It impacts us all, particularly higher inflation as we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months and all the discussion that we've seen recently about the cost of living. So why is it important and why does it affect us then? So as inflation typically increases, or the cost of prices increases, it means that we as consumers can buy fewer goods and services, or we save less as we're starting to sacrifice our savings to cover these increasing costs. If we think about it from a household perspective, the real value of household income starts to fall, particularly if wages and benefits are not increasing at the same rate as inflation is increasing. But we can also think about it from the business side as well. And the impact it has on businesses. So, for example, the money received by businesses from contractual payments, such as mobile phone bills, they don't cover the outgoing costs to the same extent as business costs start to increase with inflation. So it's really important and it impacts us all. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So when we talk about inflation, we measure inflation using a price index. And we produce a suite of price indices at the ONS to measure inflation from the consumer perspective. As I said at the start, we do produce other measures of inflation, such as the house price index or the producer price indices. But what we're going to do today is focus on our range of consumer price statistics. So we have our headline measures of inflation. That's the Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupier housing costs, also known as CPIH. And this is our most comprehensive measure. And then we also have the Consumer Prices Index, or the CPI, which is our internationally comparable measure. Okay, so these measures are both produced to give us an understanding or a measure of overall inflation in the economy. So they're produced from a macroeconomic perspective, and they're compiled using international standards and methodologies. Now, the difference between the two is the H effectively, which stands for housing costs. And just to note here, we're not talking about house prices, we're talking about housing costs, where housing costs are defined as the housing services you get from your property, such as shelter. So in CPIH, we use rental prices to measure the housing services that you get by effectively valuing these services you get from your house by looking at what it would cost to rent an equivalent property. This is based on the idea that if you did not own a house, you would have to rent one. As I said, CPI and CPIH, the Consumer Price Index and the Consumer Price Index, including housing costs, are aggregate measures. So they're designed to be representative of all households and not any individual one household. And that's partly the reason why we're relaunching the Household Cost Indices today, the HCIs, because these are going to provide us with a more granular perspective from differing household experiences. And Chris Payne is going to take us through the HCIs in a bit more detail later in this webinar. Finally, just to bring all our range of consumer prices to a close, we have the Retail Prices Index, or the RPI, which is a legacy-based measure that we produce at the ONS. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide a high-level overview now of how we produce our headline measures of consumer inflation. In basic terms, we are measuring the price of a virtual shopping basket of goods and services that reflects what we spend our money on as consumers. So we include around 700 items in the basket, and we update this each year to ensure it remains relevant or reflects changes in our spending habits. When we are updating the basket, we need to consider quite a few things. We need to consider how much households are actually spending on the items within the basket. And we take a look at the previous year to tell us how much people are spending on these items. We also need to take note of how well we can capture any variation in price for the item that we're including. And importantly, we also need to ensure that we can effectively collect prices for the item that we want to include. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So once we have our virtual basket, we then weight each item to reflect the relative importance of that item to us as consumers. So for example, most people would typically spend more on petrol than they would on apples. So we would expect the price increase for petrol to have a larger impact on the cost of our virtual basket than for apples. And we use expenditure, or the amount that we spend as households, on each item to weight each item within this basket. So weight is just a way we kind of reflect the relative importance of each of these items within this vast basket of goods and services that we use for the Consumer Prices Index. Next slide, please. So we now have our virtual basket of goods and services that reflects, as far as possible, what UK households are buying or purchasing. We then fix this basket at the start of the year, and we fix it in terms of the quantities. So how much of everything we're buying, and that's via the weights that I've just discussed, but also in terms of the quality. And it's for this reason that the Consumer Prices Index and the Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupied housing costs, are often referred to as a fixed basket index. And this is a similar approach adopted by pretty much every other country in the production of their price indices. So this fixed basket concept is important. We want to capture pure price change in our indices and not a change in price that is driven by a change in the amount of something that's being purchased. So think about a chocolate bar that's increasing in size, or the actual quality of what we're purchasing. So think about an own brand t-shirt being replaced by a designer t-shirt. So in both of those examples, we would see a price increase that is not inflationary. It's being driven by changes in what we're actually collecting. And I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a few slides. Next slide, please. So this virtual basket that we create, it covers a wide breadth of items, including both goods and services. It covers many of the staple items that we consume on a regular basis, such as food, clothing, energy costs, eating out at a restaurant, for example, but also goods and services that we purchase less frequently. And these are typically bigger ticket items, such as a foreign holiday, a new or used car, or household white goods, such as refrigerators and cookers, etc. We'll also include services such as a visit to the hairdresser and recreational items such as admission to theatres, cinemas and sport and events. So it really is a comprehensive virtual basket that we're trying to measure each month. Next slide, please. So there's our virtual basket. Now we need to think about how do we actually collect the prices that feed into that basket. So each month we will currently collect around 180,000 prices across around 140 locations within the United Kingdom. And we collect those prices for items within the basket. This is done by sending price collectors into shops and stores to physically collect the shelf prices, which we typically call the local collection. And this is outsourced to a third party. Used to be Kantar, but now they've changed to Varian. But we also collect prices online or via telephone within the ONS, within the Office for National Statistics, say for a plumber or electrician services, where we can't get all of them by collecting prices direct from shop. So that collection that takes place within the Office for National Statistics is what we will typically refer to as the central collection. So it's a really comprehensive and well-established collection process that we are actually going through every month. We are looking to transform our price collection to make use of bigger and alternative data sources. So hopefully many people would have seen last Friday, we published some exciting indicative analysis of how we will improve our indices by using big data for second-hand cars and rents. And this follows on from the introduction of big data for rail fares that we introduced last year. We're hoping to introduce second-hand cars and rents into our headline measures in March 2024. But we're also looking at collecting data directly from several major UK retailers for grocery items. So every time you go into one of the main UK grocery retailers, everything that you purchase is put through the till, through the scanner. We're looking to set up feeds of scanner data that we can then use within the production of our consumer prices. And all of this means that we will move from hundreds of thousands of prices each month to hundreds of millions, which is a really big, exciting step that we're looking to take. And we hope to move towards scanner data in 2025. Next slide, please. So I've touched on this briefly already, but it is an important principle for our headline measures of inflation, and that's the concept of price into constant quality. And this underpins all our measures using the fixed basket concept, so that we can capture genuine inflationary pressure within the numbers that we publish. So typically this issue comes about when a product that we're collecting price for is no longer available or changes, and we have a few options in terms of how we can account for this. So firstly, we can temporarily leave it out of our calculations, but this will cause us longer term issues as our sample of prices each month diminishes. Secondly, we can replace the product with something of a similar quality. So we collect what we call a comparable replacement. But what is determined as comparable can be quite subjective if we're applying that approach. Finally, we can replace the product with something of a different quality, but this means that we then need to make an adjustment to strip out any change in price that is attributed to the change in quality that we're picking up. Now, there are lots of different ways we can account for the change in quality, basically from assuming that the new good follows price movements of other similar items within our basket, through to using more advanced statistical models for technological goods where products are changing quite frequently. Next slide, please. Just to give an example of quality change and how we account for it, one well-known quality change that we deal with quite frequently is where we get a change in product size, which is sometimes referred to or known as shrinkflation. So this is where a product typically gets smaller, but the price doesn't change. And this is an implicit increase in price that we need to reflect in our indices. And we do this by applying an adjustment based on the change in quantity that we pick up. So by way of an example then, we assume that a chocolate bar is 150 grams in January and costs £2. So we'll continue pricing that same bar of chocolate each month. And then in May, when we collect the price, we notice that the price remains the same at £2, but the size of the chocolate bar has become smaller. It's now 100 grams. So the consumer is getting less for their money, but at this stage, there is no change in shelf price. So in this example, we apply the change in size as a ratio to make an adjustment to the price change that we're picking up. Whereas originally we are seeing no price change, the quantity adjustment allows us to reflect the reduction in size as a price increase. So we would be showing a 50% increase in price. And this reflects the fact that you are now getting less product for your money. So it's really important we keep on top of this and other such issues within every item that we collect data for in our virtual basket. Next slide, please. So once we have collected all our prices, thousands and thousands of prices, and we've carried out the necessary quality adjustments and overall quality assurance, we then calculate our indices. So the basic idea here is that we're trying to reprice our virtual basket each month. So how much is the overall cost of the basket this month compared to last month, last year, and so on. So remember earlier I mentioned weights, and these are important to ensure that the price change or any price change in the basket is given its relative importance in the changing cost of the overall basket. Now, mathematically, the approach we take is identical to calculating a weighted average of price change across the whole basket. Next slide, please. So in reality, our overall CPIH or CPI is a basket of baskets. We use the classification structure as a framework for combining each of our baskets that we calculate prices for. The classification we use for consumer prices that we use to combine goods and services together is based on the ultimate purpose or use, and it's called COICOPS. That's the classification of individual consumption by purpose. And this is an internationally recognised and agreed classification structure that allows consistency across various countries producing consumer price inflation. We then calculate a price index at each level of our classification by combining them together to give us our higher level indices. So for example, we will combine all the thousands of prices we collect for whiskey, brandy, etc. to give us a price index for our spirits basket. Our spirits basket is then combined with the basket for beer and wine to give us our overall alcohol price basket. And then this is combined with food and so on until we get to our overall CPI. It's worth reiterating that our headline measures of inflation are designed to be representative of spending habits across the UK as a whole and not totally reflect the habits of any individual consumer. So obviously this is where the household cost indices come in today to provide more granularity regarding how inflation represents different household groups. And just finally, also to help further with this, we have a nice interactive tool on the ONS website called the Personal Inflation Calculator. And this allows users to input their own spending and see what their personal inflation rate is and how it compares to the headline UK average that we produce. So I will now hand over to Natalie, who's going to talk us through how to use our inflation data. Natalie.
Thanks, Chris. So my name's Natalie. I'm the Deputy Head of the Prices Development and Responsive Analysis. As Chris said, today I'm going to talk you through how to use our inflation data. So firstly, I'm going to provide you with 4 examples of how our data are used. The first is through monetary policy. So the UK government sets a target rate for inflation. Currently, it is a CPI annual rate of 2%. If the inflation rate target is missed by more than 1 percentage point either side of the target, then the Governor of the Bank of England must write to the Chancellor to explain why and set out what they'll do to get inflation back to 2%. The Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee sets the base interest rate to keep inflation at 2%. So between December 2021 and August 2023, the base rate increased from 0.1% to 5.25% in response to rising inflation. Move on to the next slide, please. So another example of using our inflation statistics is when uprating household payments. Uprating is when the government increases the value of certain payments or benefits. The state pension currently rises in line with the highest out of the CPI annual inflation rate for September, average wage growth between May and July, and 2.5%. You may recognise this as the triple lock. We can move on to the next slide, please. Many private contracts are also linked to an annual inflation measure to cover increasing costs. And finally, you might also want to understand whether inflation has affected different kinds of households differently. And for this, you can use our household cost indices. Chris Payne will be showing you the results of these in our next session. So Chris Jenkins has talked you through our range of consumer price statistics earlier. As a reminder, we have 4 different measures. The CPIH and CPI measures are based around economic principles, and the CPIH is our most comprehensive measure, while the CPI is comparable across the EU and the USA. The household cost indices provides insights into different household experiences of inflation, while the RPI is our legacy measure. Can move on to the next slide, please. So we publish 3 key pieces of information each month: the price index, the annual rate of change, and the monthly rate. The price index shows a cumulative price change from a fixed point in time. Currently, our reference period is 2015. The annual rate of change is in the prices show the change in price from the same month 1 year ago, while the monthly rate shows the change in prices from the previous month, but that can be subject to seasonal influences. So for example, clothing sales. We can move on to the next slide, thank you. In the following slides, I will use an example to show you how to interpret our data. Here you can see our household cost indices data from 2014 to now. The top chart is our price index, which shows how prices have risen over time, while the bottom chart is our annual rate of change. So this compares how prices have changed in comparison to the previous year. This example will show you how the annual inflation rate is derived from the index, which is the first thing we calculate directly from the basket. Move to the next slide, please. Here you can see that when you compare the index for May 2021 and May 2022, the difference is 10.1%. This is reflected in our annual rate of change for May 2022 in the chart below. To move on to the next slide, please. If you were to look at a slightly earlier month, you would then also look back in time at that same month in the previous year. So in this example, the index grew less than in May 2022 at 7.4%. Move on to the next slide, please. And another example, so if you were to look at the data for an earlier period again, it is important to note that a fall in the annual rate doesn't mean that prices are falling. They are just growing more slowly. That is, unless we see a negative annual rate of change. Go to the next slide, please. When we publish our data, we lead with the annual inflation rate, and this is what the government targets too. The price index shows the price change over the longer term. This is where you can understand the impact of things like Brexit and the coronavirus pandemic. However, often we're also interested in what has happened more recently. For short-term comparisons, we could compare prices with the previous month. However, short-term volatility can make the data harder to interpret, and seasonal factors may influence the monthly rate. Move on to the next slide, please. This example will show you why the monthly rate isn't always helpful. So in January 2023, household cost indices for clothing prices fell by 3.2%. This was a much bigger drop than the fall of 0.3% observed in the month before, so in December 2022. Move on to the next bit, please. However, clothing prices fall every January because of the January sales. So in January 2022, they fell by a similar month as they did in January 2023. So if we look at changes on an annual basis, we actually saw prices rose by 6.1% between January 2022 and January 2023. We can move to the next slide, please. Another aspect you might hear us talk about are the contributions to the annual growth. This answers the question of how we know which goods and services are driving the annual inflation rate, which ones are changing in price more quickly, and which have the biggest impact. We can move to the next slide, please. The annual growth rate is influenced by both the component's price movement and also its weight. The components of price indices are weighted using the amount we spend on these items to ensure that it reflects their relative importance. So going back to Chris Jenkins' example of apples and petrol, if apples were to increase by a large amount, it wouldn't have as much of an impact on the overall inflation rate in comparison to if petrol prices had increased. This is because apples have a smaller weight, because less amount of money is spent on apples than on petrol overall. So to calculate the contribution, we want to calculate a set of additive components that will sum to the annual inflation rate. These contributions can be positive or negative. A positive contribution means that the item is pushing the annual inflation rate up, while a negative contribution means that the item is pulling the inflation rate down. Move on to the next slide, please. Here is an example of a contributions chart for the household cost indices. The black dotted line is the inflation rate for all households, and the bars show the contribution from each of the different categories. In May 2022, in the most recent period in that chart, we can see the contribution from housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels has the highest contribution. While at the beginning of 2021, we can see some negative contributions to the annual inflation rate. Move on to the next slide, please. When thinking about the household cost indices, we also want to consider the contributions to the difference in annual growth between household groups. This is simply the difference between the contributions for any two subgroups, such as retired and non-retired households. Chris Payne will talk you through an example of this later in this session. Move to the next slide, please. I'm now going to hand you over to Tim, who is going to talk to you about the tools that you can use to use our data.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Tim Kershaw. I'm the data visualization lead at the ONS. My team create the interactive tools on the ONS website to tell the stories and help people find insights in the data that we publish. For our work to have a positive impact on society, it must be understandable and usable by people who may be experts in their field, but not necessarily experts in statistics or economics. From spring 2024, we aim to publish the household cost indices in a way that allows users to filter the data, make comparisons, and visualize the results. To publish the data in the way that would be most useful to you, we'd like to invite you to co-design a digital tool. This will not require a significant time commitment. We envisage around 2 hours between now and the end of February. You'll be asked to explain how you think this data may be useful to you, your interest in the data. You'll be asked to test prototypes and to provide feedback. If you'd like to participate, please either comment in the Slido with your email address, or if you prefer, write to outreach.engagement.community@ons.gov.uk. The address appears on the screen and will appear at the end of this session. Please give this some thought as you listen to Chris's presentation, which is following from now, and get a better understanding of the use of the HCIs. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Tim. So my name's Chris. I lead the team that has been developing the household cost indices and are now producing them on a quarterly basis. And we just wanted to wrap up this session by sharing some of the findings from the latest publication with you. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So just by way of a recap, the household cost indices and what they are. So the aim of the household cost indices really is just to try and reflect how different types of households are experiencing changing prices and costs. So this is a complement to our other measures of inflation, CPI and CPIH, which give an economy-wide view of what's happening with inflation. The idea of the household cost indices is to kind of zoom in on different households and their individual experiences of inflation. As part of this, it means that we're measuring the things that households spend their money on in a slightly different way. So one example here is mortgage interest payments and owner-occupied housing costs. So Chris talked a little bit about this in his session at the start. So we aim to try and capture owner-occupied housing costs in our inflation measures as a reflection of the service that households get from owning their own home and living in it. That's excluded from CPI for various complicated reasons, and we include it in CPIH in a sort of technical way by imputing an equivalent rent. But with the household cost indices, we're trying to understand the experience of households, and so we want to try and capture it in a more direct way. So we include things like mortgage interest payments, stamp duty, land tax, which households pay when they buy a house, dwelling insurance, and various other factors. If we could have the next slide, please, Karen. Thank you. So thinking about the overall rate of the household cost indices, so the prices of the different things in the basket of goods and services will change over time, and they'll all change at different rates. Some will change more quickly, some will change less quickly. But the price changes of these things in the basket all contribute to changes in the overall growth rate. But also the things that we spend more money on will have a greater impact as well. So this is the weight point that Chris and Natalie both talked about. So we wanted to use this as an opportunity to dig into the household cost indices in a little bit more detail and try and find some effects from some of the things that we've seen happening over the last couple of years. So energy costs is perhaps a good starting point. I think everyone's conscious of what's happened with rising energy costs over the last couple of years. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So just by way of a recap on that, so the off-gen price cap was introduced back in January 2019 as a way of trying to control how much energy prices can rise. And over the last sort of couple of years, since 2021, we've seen some quite large increases in the price cap for various reasons. At the same time, in October 2022, the government introduced its energy price guarantee, which basically limited the average energy bill to £2,500. This was at the same time as an off-gen price cap rise, but it meant that on average customers paid £2,500. So let's have a look at how that impacts the household cost indices. So just starting at a high level, this shows the annual inflation rates for retired and non-retired households over the period from January 2021 to July 2023. We can see that the rates for both household groups peaked in October 2022, with retired households facing the higher rate of 14.2% compared with 11.9% for non-retired households. More recently, that relationship has reversed, so non-retired households are facing a slightly higher rate now of 8.3% in September 2023, compared with 7.8% for retired households. So we want to try and understand what's driving the rates for those two different subgroups and what's driving the differences between them. So if we could move on to the next slide. So this is where contributions come into play, which is what Natalie was talking about. So the line on the chart shows the annual rate for retired households, which is basically what we just showed you on the previous chart. And the bars show how much each spending category is contributing to that rate. So the bigger the bar, the more it contributes. And that reflects both the item's weight, so how much importance it has in the average retired household's basket, and how fast prices are growing in that category. So there's some interesting things going on here. So we can see on the chart that the bottom bar shows food and non-alcoholic beverages, which I think is an area that most people are conscious of seeing rising prices over the last few years. And the chart shows how that has had an increasing contribution to the rate for retired households over the period. But the biggest bar is for housing, water, electricity, gas and other fuels. So that's quite a big category. It includes housing costs, it includes energy bills and some other bits and pieces as well. So on the next slide, we go into that in a bit more detail. So this chart breaks down the contributions to housing in more detail. So the chart shows that by far the biggest contribution in this category is coming from energy bills, from electricity, gas and other fuels. And the contribution actually steps up in line with the price cap. So the sort of blocks where it increases show where the energy price cap has changed. And so that shows the impact that the changes in the price cap are having on inflation for retired households on a HCI basis. And that peak in October 22, that coincides with the introduction of the government's energy price guarantee. And the contribution has come back down again since then, which is partly to do with the fact that because prices were high a year ago, we're comparing prices with a relatively high base. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So how does that look for non-retired households now? So we've just seen how energy bills have affected inflation rates for retired households. This chart shows the same effects for non-retired households. Actually, the chart shows a similar picture. There's increasing food and non-alcoholic beverages costs over the period, and the largest contribution comes from housing and household services. So how can we understand what's driving the difference between inflation rates for retired and non-retired households? What we can do is we can look at contributions to the difference. So if we subtract the contributions for non-retired households from the contributions for retired households, that will tell us which spending categories are pushing inflation up for retired households and which are pushing inflation up for non-retired households. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. That's what this chart here shows. So on this chart, the bars on the positive side of the axis, so the bars that are above zero, are the spending categories that are contributing to higher inflation for retired households. The bars on the negative axis below zero are the spending categories that are contributing to higher inflation for non-retired households. So looking at that impact from energy bills, the chart shows that up until December 2022, the contribution from energy bills for retired households was much bigger than for non-retired households, and that's what's pushed their inflation rate up relative to the inflation rate for non-retired households. And the reason for that is because energy bills reflect a much bigger proportion of the basket for retired households. So because the basket is proportional, weights are expressed as parts of a whole, retired households have a bigger share from energy bills. So you might expect, for example, that retired households that own their own home will have paid off their mortgage by this point. And so the mortgage costs aren't a part of their basket. So overall, all the other parts of their basket have a bigger proportion. And so they will spend more on things like energy bills, food and non-alcoholic beverages. And that's why we see a bigger contribution from those areas. So the weight for retired households in 2022 was 6.5% for energy bills, and that compared with 4% for non-retired households. But what's interesting as well about this chart is that the contribution from housing costs actually flips in December 2022. So from January 2022, it's actually making a bigger contribution to non-retired households' inflation rate. So why is that? Oh, if we move on a slide, we can have a look. So I think Natalie gave an example of the how CPI is used to set the base rate by the Bank of England. So the Bank of England targets inflation at 2%, and it uses CPI to do that. And the way that it tries to maintain CPI inflation at 2% is by changing the base rate. So the idea, I think, loosely is that as the base rate increases, that feeds through to the products that loan providers will offer, for example. So it tends to make borrowing more expensive for households, but it also potentially encourages them to save. And so that will reduce demand in the economy, which hopefully will pull prices back down to the target rate. So what we've seen over the last sort of couple of years is that the Bank of England has raised the base rate 13 times in response to increasing CPI inflation. And so how has that fed through into housing? Well, if we go on to the next slide, this chart here shows, again, it shows the contribution to the difference, but in this slide, we've zoomed in on the contribution to difference from owner-occupied housing costs. And the bulk of the contribution to the difference there is mortgage interest payments. And so because non-retired households, a lot of non-retired households will be paying off a mortgage, as opposed to retired households who will tend to have paid off a mortgage, that non-retired households will have a much bigger weight for mortgage interest payments. And so the increases that we've seen in the base rate and in the mortgage rates that are subsequently offered has had an increasing contribution to the difference for non-retired households, and that's offset the reducing contributions that we've seen from energy payments. So we can see that the weight there for non-retired households for mortgage interest payments is 2.8%, and that compares with just 0.2% for retired households. So what we're seeing in more recent periods is that the impact of mortgage interest payments is outweighing the impact from energy costs for non-retired households. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We do also include other forms of interest in the HCIs, so that the previous chart showed mortgage interest payments, but we also include interest on loans, overdrafts, credit cards, that kind of thing. They're included in the miscellaneous goods and services category, which is having a much smaller impact on the difference between inflation for retired and non-retired households. But this chart just shows the contribution to the difference in miscellaneous goods and services, just because I wanted to try and draw out the impact from other forms of interest as well. So the chart shows on the negative axis that there's a sort of more moderate contribution coming from increasing interest payments on other forms of debt, and that's similarly pushing inflation higher for non-retired households compared with retired households. You would expect, I think, that non-retired households would have more access to the kind of products that would incur an interest charge, so loans and credit cards, that kind of thing. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that was a bit of an exploration of how some of the changes that we've seen over the last couple of years have affected inflation rates for retired and non-retired households. But I just wanted to quickly just sort of summarize what that looks like across all of the different subgroups that we publish. So we've shown you retired and non-retired households, but there are lots of other subgroups that we produce as well. So households with children and households without children. So in September 2023, they've seen inflation rates of 8.4% and 8.1% respectively again. And this is due to mortgage interest payments again. So the households without children tends to have quite a big overlap with retired households, and so you see less of a contribution coming through from mortgage interest payments there compared with households with children. We produce subgroups by income decile. Income decile basically means that you rank every household according to its income, and then you cut it up into 10 equally sized proportions. So the low income households in September 2023 saw a very similar rate of inflation to high income households and middle income households. So they were all around about 8.123%. In this case, what we see is that high income households will have a higher contribution from mortgage interest rates. Low income households will have higher contributions from food and from energy bills, but they offset each other quite neatly in this particular example. Albeit in the peak of inflation in October 2022, there was a much bigger gap with low income households experiencing the highest rate. We also produce a split by tenure type, so the different types of housing. as you might expect, mortgage households have got the highest inflation rate in September 2023 across all of the groups. And that, of course, that's due to mortgage interest payments. The social renter and outright owner-occupier household subgroups have got sort of mid-range inflation rates. With social renters, you've got this profile where energy costs and food costs have a higher weight. And I think with outright owner occupiers, most of those tend to be retired, so they've got quite a similar profile to retired households. And then we saw the lowest rate from private renter households at 7.2%. If we could move on to the final slide, please. Thank you. So just to summarise, that was a very quick snapshot of some of the findings from the latest household costs indices, but hopefully that helps to demonstrate that they're a useful tool for trying to understand how the rising cost of living is impacting on different kinds of households in a different way. And hopefully we've shown as well how you can use the different spending categories to try and dig into the data to see how the different things that we've seen happening in the real world, how those are affecting the inflation rates for different kinds of households. So that was all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Presenters, thank you for those excellent slides. I'm going to go over to some of the questions that we've got on from the Slido chat. So first of all, we've got 2 questions around what some of the elements that might be in the new HCI data. So I'm not sure who might want to take this one. So I'll read it as is, which is, will the new HCI incorporate all capital outlays on OOH, including renovation outlays, as well as was the original plan of the Household Inflation Index? And whoever takes this one might be worth just explaining some of those acronyms for our audience as well, if that's all right.
Thank you, Emily. I can see there's another one immediately below it about the treatment of insurance as well, so I might take those 2 together if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yes, so this is about owner-occupied housing costs. So this is where Chris spoke about the costs that homeowners, or people who live and own their own home, face. So at the moment, we're incorporating those housing costs through mortgage interest payments, stamp duty, that kind of thing. But in the paper that Jill Leyland and John Astin wrote towards a household inflation index, where they almost sort of set out a proposal for what we now refer to as the household costs indices, they recommended including the capital mortgage repayments and also outright house purchases should be included as part of the household inflation index. I think there are pros and cons as to why you might want to include that in there, and this has been a topic of debate at our advisory panels for quite some time. There are no plans to include capital mortgage repayments or the cost of purchasing a house in the HCI as it currently stands. At one point, we had talked about doing a variant measure, the HCIC, which would include that so that people could understand the impact of buying a house essentially on homeowners. At the moment, we don't have any plans to take that forward, so it is just the cost of mortgage interest payments. On the insurance point, so I think these topics will be discussed a lot more in the technical session, actually, which immediately follows this one. But just to try and summarise, the way that we include insurance costs, or the weight for insurance in CPI and CPIH, we basically strip out a part of that weight or a part of the expenditure that underpins the weight, because when households pay insurance premiums, part of that goes into the administration for the insurance service, but part of it will go into a claims pool, which the insurance providers then pay back out to households to reimburse them for loss through damage or theft. And that money then gets spent in other areas of the basket. So to avoid double counting, we take it out of the weight for insurance in CPI and CPIH. The approach that we use in HCIs, and the approach that we are using now, is that we actually treat it on a gross basis. So because we want to capture the payments that households are making, we take the full weight for insurance. We don't try and strip out the claims pool, because we want to reflect the fact that households are making these larger payments on insurance. So that is included now. So capital costs aren't included, but gross insurance weights are.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. I'm going to pick up on quite a simple one. So where in the monthly inflation release would HCI be published?
So we provide a bulletin which has got some contextual analysis in it. So the all households rate will be included in there in the main points, but also in the detailed analysis section. If you want to find the actual numbers themselves, there is a publication table that sits alongside it. And we've got detail in there on all the various different subgroups and a high level rate for all households as well. And that includes annual growth rates, price indices, weights, contributions, and contributions to the differences over a period of time.
Brilliant, thank you. And then quite a popular question is around when doing cost analysis and aggregating things like club card prices and net prices considered in the price of any given good.
Do you want me to take this, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so when we collect our prices, we follow a principle that they mustn't be discriminatory, and this is the same that's applied across kind of the international community in the collection of prices for the consumer price index. And what we mean by that is that the price offer has got to be available to all. So when we think about those types of discount schemes that you mentioned, you only get access to those discounts by applying to be a member of that discount scheme. So we would treat them as discriminatory and not include them currently in our measures of inflation. That's not to say that we can't do anything, hopefully, when scanner data comes along in terms of the impact of discount, but for the time being, we wouldn't include them for those reasons.
Well, thank you very much. And then will we be able to use these tools to measure inflation for households across a whole area, for example, London Borough?
Again, I can try this, Chris, and you can perhaps follow up. So as I said at the start, the measures that we produce are typically designed to be representative of the UK as a whole, notwithstanding obviously the different household groups that Chris has spoke about. So at the moment, we don't produce the measures of inflation by different regions because the collection that we use is designed to be reflective of the UK as a whole. We have done some research recently, and I think Chris can talk about Northern Ireland, but I'll just mention we have been working with Southampton University historically to look at the level of quality that we could produce for regional indices just using the prices that we collect for the national CPI. And as expected, because they're set up for a UK measure, when you want to produce a regional measure, you need a lot more sample. They do get quite volatile, so it's proven that the data that we've got at the moment is not super for regional prices. But Chris, do you want to just pick up on Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I can do. So we have recently done a pilot with the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland, who funded a sample boost, basically to allow us to collect more prices in the Northern Ireland area. And so we have published some early findings from that research. We ran the pilot for, I think, just over a year. So you can find that on our website. But I think, it does reflect the fact that doing regional prices is quite complicated, and we would need to collect more prices to get a more robust measure of inflation.
Well, thank you very much. I know you might have touched on this in one of your earlier answers, Chris, P, that is there scope to create variations of CPI to do a basket for basic goods versus a basket for mean or median goods?
I think so. I mean, I think we would have to define what we mean by sort of mean median goods, but we did publish some analysis a couple of years back looking at discretionary versus non-discretionary goods, for example. So that was some analysis our economist teams did within the ONS. I think there's a degree of subjectivity when you're thinking about what's discretionary and what's non-discretionary, so it's not always easy to assign a product to one thing or another. But you certainly can do it, and you can always sort of construct different aggregates. So, for example, we can look at goods inflation versus services inflation as well. So we have done something like that in the past. So there is some interesting stuff on our website. Perhaps we could send out a link after the event to share that in more detail with people.
Brilliant, thank you. And then is there any plan to publish seasonally adjusted data for inflation measures?
So I'll take that one. The simple answer there is no. That's not to say we don't use seasonal adjustment in any of our inflation measures. I've already mentioned the house price index, where we do publish a seasonally adjusted measure, but we're not producing seasonally adjusted measures of consumer price inflation.
Well, thank you. So we've got one here around a potential issue with measuring clothing inflation. Where can we find the CPI, CPIH and RPI excluding clothing?
So I mean, if it's the clothing issue, that was quite a while ago. We don't publish separate measures that exclude clothing, but the individual component indexes that we do produce are available on the website along with their weights. So if someone wanted to, you could recalculate these measures, excluding clothing for your own benefit. I think I'm right, Chris, in saying that we don't produce any measure without clothing, but it can be done using the tables that we publish if a user so wishes.
Well, okay, and then what's the weight for energy bills in CPI, CPIH and RPI, and assuming they're different, which is the best?
So I did see this question come in, so I've just been scrambling to get the weights. So for CPI, the combined weight of gas and electric is just under 5% of the basket. It's a bit smaller for CPIH at about 4.2%, because obviously we include housing costs, which kind of takes away some of the weight of these items in the basket. And then for the retail prices index, it's higher at 7.4% for gas and electric. So the weight in RPI is higher. We've been quite clear that we kind of see the CPI and the CPIH as our most comprehensive measures of inflation, and the sources of expenditure we use to calculate weights for CPI are more comprehensive than the single source that we use for RPI. So from our perspective, we feel that the weights that we use in CPI and CPIH are better.
Well, thank you very much. So then we've got, how does this work relate to work being undertaken by ONS to change the way poverty is measured, so moving away from an approach solely based on income?
So I'm not sure, to be honest. We might have to take that one away because that reflects kind of other areas of the office where we're doing work. So we can perhaps pick that one up and circulate a response with the slides. Brilliant,
thank you. And then so I've got one here, probably following on from something we just touched on. Last kind of two questions we've got time for before we wrap up. So we've got shrinkflation is an ONS concept. When evaluating cost, is it included for reduction in quality, outcome, reliability, for example, education, health, public toilets, post transport, etc.?
So no, we typically apply shrinkflation to physical goods that we can measure, such as the grocery basket items that we use the example for. I guess in terms of those items that were mentioned, I think we would have to account for changes there in the update of the basket every year, where we would change the type of good or service that we're measuring to reflect changes in the service being offered. So we would capture it when we update the basket, but not as quickly as we would capture shrinkflation for items such as like a bar of chocolate in the example I've mentioned. Not sure if I've missed anything there, Chris.
No, I was only gonna say that I think with quality change, the approach you take will relate to the thing that you're trying to control quality for. So for technological goods, for example, laptops, tablets, that kind of thing, we will use statistical models to try and objectively capture the value of quality change, because it's quite complex and there's quite a lot of things that can change in technological items. But we do have a set of objective criteria that we can build a model on, so we can say what the memory of the old model versus the new model is, for example. Whereas I think for some things there's a degree of subjectivity. If you're talking about things like a postal service, for example, it's quite hard to quantify what we mean by quality and to put a value on it. So And thinking about sort of proportionality as well, you know, the weight of those things and the price change of those things, they may not have a great impact overall anyway. So there's a range of different kind of considerations that we would take into account when thinking about how we would control for the quality of different goods and services.
Oh, thank you very much. And just to close on the final question, which we may or may not be able to answer because unfortunately we're not oracles, but when do you think the inflation will decrease to the 2% annual target? Anyone hazard a guess?
Might pass this on to Chris. No, seriously, we're quite clear. We just report on prices as we collect them, not forecasting. So there's obviously a lot of attention, but we wouldn't necessarily forecast.
Well, thank you very much. So just to close up, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today. There is on the Slido screen for you, if you can click over from the question pane to the poll pane, you will be able to give us a quick answer to literally 4 very, very fast questions to let us know how you found the session today. We'd love to hear if it was useful to you and if you're going to use these data moving forward. And yes, thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. We will follow up with the slides, and if we can, we'll follow up with an answer to that wider question as well around measuring poverty. And if you're not already signed up for it, there will be one final event on HCIs following this one very shortly, which is looking at the technicality and the detail of these data. So if that sounds like it's something you'd be interested in, that is following this session very shortly. But thank you very much today, and thank you for joining us.